The topic of today's talk is called oneing. And as we heard in our words of integration this morning, that word was used by the medieval Christian mystic Julian of Norwich, who was silenced by the church. Now, I know all of this can be very difficult for us to wrap our heads around, but I do believe that you are ready to hear this. So today we're going to dive very deep. So put your thinking caps on. Julian of Norwich, Jesus, all the great mystics and spiritual teachers tell us that we are not two, we are one. In today's gospel message, Jesus is continuing the message that we started last Sunday, which is known as the farewell discourse. This is Jesus' goodbye words to his apostles. He's giving them on the night before his arrest and trial. So he's telling them, I'm not going to be with you much longer. But as you heard, he said, I'm not going to leave you orphaned. I'm going to give you another advocate who will be with you always. Who or what is this advocate? Well, the word advocate comes from the root word voco, that Latin voco. You know what it means? Voice. And Jesus says this advocate will be with you and within you. There's a voice. Jesus called it the Spirit of truth. It is within you. And the purpose of a healthy religion is to connect you with that voice. As we heard in our words of integration, religion is relegio, to realign. The reason we are here every Sunday should be to realign ourselves with that voice, to connect us with that inner voice, to unite us so that we can become one, not two, but one. Jesus gave us a mathematical equation in today's gospel. He said, I am in God, God is in me, and I am in you. So remember from math class, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Okay. And what the mystics like Julian of Norwich were about is the uniting of the A and the C. Mysticism is becoming one with God. And most of the Christian mystics were silenced by the church. Now, the very early Christians, the first followers of Jesus, were known as the Gnostics. It's spelled Gnostic, Gnostic. And Gnostic means knowing, but not intellectual knowing, but knowing of the heart. That intimacy, like I know you. And the Gnostics believed, as Jesus did, that the kingdom of heaven was within us. That's where God dwells. And so they believed that we could have access to that kingdom by knowing the divine intimately, by becoming one with it. In our first reading this morning from the Acts of the Apostles, Paul is telling that crowd of Athenians, he says, you don't have to search for God. God's not far from you. He says, for we live, move, and have our being in God. We are in God, and God is in us. It's not two, it's one. That's the purpose of the spiritual life. Unfortunately, the Christian church has been about worshiping one person who became one with God. But that person, Jesus, wanted us to become one with God. He wanted us to do as he did. But we haven't seemed to get that message more than 2,000 years later. Now, one of the contemporary spiritual writers that I quote most frequently is Marcus Borg. Marcus Borg is one of the founding fathers of progressive Christianity. And if you get our weekly epistle newsletter on Fridays, you saw this quote that I had from Marcus Borg. He says, "The Christian life is not about pleasing God the finger shaker and judge. It's not about believing now and being good now for the sake of heaven later. It's about entering into a relationship in the present that begins to change everything now. Spirituality is about this process, the opening of the heart to the God who is already there. The opening of the heart to the God who is already there. That's what religion should be about." Richard Rohr says something similar. He says, "We've worshiped Jesus instead of following him on the same path. We made Jesus into a mere religion instead of a journey towards union with God. This made us into a religion of belonging and believing instead of a religion of transformation." And back to Marcus Borg, he says, 2 questions for us to consider. 1, is the Christian life centrally about believing, or is it about a relationship? Is it about believing in God as some supernatural being who's out there, or is it about a relationship with Spirit who is right here? We have been taught in the Christian church that God was out there. We needed to please the God who's out there, so we'll be rewarded later. That's not what Jesus was about. Jesus wanted us to do as he did, not to worship him as the only one. Most of us say we're believers. We believe in God. But the mystics, the Gnostics, and Jesus want us to move from believing in God to becoming like God. Now that may seem heretical to some of you, that your purpose is to become like God. But the truth of the matter is, the truth of your being is, that you were created in the image and likeness of God. You are the oneing of God. You are God's expression. So Jesus gave us the instructions for us to become like God. He said, "Forgive one another. Take care of the poor. Feed the hungry. Take care of the least of these." When we behave this way, we behave like God does. And so we're practicing becoming like God, and we're getting in touch with our true nature. The false self doesn't do those things. The false self wants to receive for itself alone. The true self does as Jesus did. Jesus gave us the instructions to follow, the path to follow. And you heard it in today's gospel. Jesus said, "God will be revealed to you if you follow my commandments." And what were Jesus' commandments? There were only 2. He said, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So when you love your neighbor, you are behaving like God. And how do you show love for God? Through devotion, through prayer and meditation. We know it says, "Be still and know that I am God." When you practice prayer and meditation every day, you're attuning yourself to the voice within. Eckhart Tolle said when he had his breakthrough, he said, "What a liberation it is to realize that the voice in my head is not who I am." And then he asks, "Well, who am I then?" "I am the one who sees that." In prayer and meditation, as we attune ourselves to that voice, we realize that the voices in our head are not who we are. Who are we? We are the observer of that. We are one with God, not two, one. Now, we have been talking this morning about Christian mystics, but some of you have heard the term Kabbalah. Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism, predates Christian mysticism. And one of the leading scholars today of Kabbalah is Rabbi Berg. And Rabbi Berg has a book that is called Becoming Like God. And here's what he says. We become like God by systematically destroying the ego. Because the desire of the ego, the desire to receive for self alone, is the opposite of God. And we become like God by transforming into beings of sharing, because God is a force of infinite sharing. The journey to God means moving to a place where we place others before us. In other words, becoming like God means behaving like God. Can you imagine if everybody in the world who said they believed in God started to actually behave like God? That was Jesus's wish for us. That was his dream, to create this kingdom of heaven here on earth so that we could manifest the oneness, so that we could be one with the one. So, how do we do this? We do this by attuning ourselves to the voice within and seeing the oneness in everyone, especially those who are the least of these. In Jesus' final words, his very final prayer, he prayed that they may all be one. Those of you who have become members of Douglas UCC, you receive a pin. And on the pin, that's what it says, that they may all be one. You, my friends, whether you realize it or not, you are one with the one. You are the oneing of love, the oneing of God. May you recognize more fully that truth of your being, and may that truth transform you and set you free. Namaste.